check this. Yes. All right. But yes, my goal is in fact just to talk about the parts of chapter 7 that we haven't really talked about, but if there are things in here, like I'll tell you the pieces, chapter 8, I'm sorry, not 7. 7 is the mobile app. In chapter 8 that I want to talk about, and we did talk about certain things. I'll kind of tell you which ones that I'm going to skip over as far as that chapter is concerned, but and only because we've talked about it already, but if you want clarification on any of that or just to go through it again, I am more than happy to go through it. It's all just fixing common problems within a photo. Things like if your sky isn't blue enough, an easy way to fix that. The healing and clone stamp tool in there, kind of how that might differ from what you would use in Photoshop if you haven't used it yet. Just things like that. Backlit photos, reducing noise, sharpening. So there are quite a few good little tricks in here, and this chapter is really great to go back to, especially the numbers that he uses as far as sharpening is concerned. I think they're good values to maybe even just save and plug in, or just plug in manually and tweak from there, because I think he has a really good starting point as far as the values he gives. So that's really what we're gonna focus on today and just kind of cover those things. So I am just gonna start at the beginning and flip through. And I do have the book files. Maybe, there we go. And as just a random reminder, because for whatever reason I'm remembering it right now, there are a bunch of events at Heritage Hill that they're still looking for people to photograph. There are field trips that they have. Usually they're in the morning during the week with all the kids from school and stuff like that, and they just like to capture some images of that. And then they have like their Halloween thing. I think it's 2 days, the 21st and the 28th, I believe. They're both Saturdays. I have somebody who was available for one of those days, and I can't remember.
Right here.
Yes.
I'll do it.
Yeah, so if anyone is interested, I have the contact name for that stuff. They have a Christmas one later on. They have three main events. I'd have to open up Blackboard to find them. But I just know the Halloween one is coming up, so I just wanted to put that out there again in case anyone's interested. And those field trips are kind of all over the place until November.
I've never been there.
It's kind of cool. It's been a long time since I've been there. Actually, Christine in your group, she works there.
Yeah, she said that. She's like, we could do something at Heritage Hill.
That's
for
true.
the project. But then she's like, I don't want to talk about work. I was like,
That's
okay.
awesome. I'll get you Erin's contact information. But if anyone is interested in doing any of that stuff, just let me know. I know it's easy to forget all the opportunities we post, but I know that one's coming up. So I just wanted to say it again. And they all count. If you're in portfolio and promo, or you will be, or you are going to get to that point over another semester or two, you can bank all those hours for those 20 hours, so it all counts. Just so you know. Workflow. Let's see. So, chapter 8. So I do have a folder on the server for the chapter 8 images. If you had wanted to use those rather than your own, you can certainly use your own. But I know you might not have all of these. So feel free to copy that to your desktop and then import them into Lightroom. Wow, that copied really fast. It's good practice just importing anyway. Desktop, chapter 8. There we go. Don't import, add to collection. I should probably make a collection set and just store all my class stuff. But I don't have one made. Import. Finish importing. Sorry, I just have to organize this for my own sanity. I'm just creating a classic collection set and just putting the chapter images in there so that I don't get it mixed up, because this is my catalog for all my stuff. Okay, so if you wanted to use those are there. Feel free. Capture time. I want file names so that they're in order. There we go. Oh, I should turn on your pods. That would help, wouldn't it? And make it easier to see some things. Okay, so starting at the beginning of this chapter, he is talking about fixing common problems. And one of the big things is we often have a lot of backlit photos where the sky is exposed properly, but the foreground is dark simply because we have to expose one over the other. So exposing the sky in this case worked a little bit better, and we just need to then brighten up the foreground, or the buildings in this case. So the exposure itself is fine, but we want to see more detail in these buildings. So we're going to play with a couple of things. We certainly could use an adjustment brush for this, but we probably can just use the adjustment tools in the basic panel and other areas to try and correct this without having to use the adjustment brush. So I'd say that's always a good thing to try first, is because it's just easier than having to do your settings with the adjustment brush and then tweaking it a little bit and then making sure that you're masking it correctly and that kind of stuff. If you can make an adjustment to the overall photo and do a global adjustment, it's probably going to save you some time. Not saying not to use the adjustment brush, because it is like we live and breathe the adjustment brush, but we're just going to play with the sliders first to see if we can get rid of it globally and still expose our sky correctly. So I'm going to use this image, the one he's using in the book. I'm going to go to the develop module, so I'm going to hit D to flip over there. You know, there's one thing, I'm going to backtrack for just a quick second. I don't usually talk about this, but I want to show you it's there. I don't know many people that use it, but in the library module, there is a quick develop button on the right-hand side where all your keywording and stuff is. And this has just very quick basic adjustments that you can do with exposure, clarity, and vibrance, along with basic white balance settings that you can do here. And you'll see it's just either quick little changes that you can do or big drastic changes, kind of like a play forward, play back, and then fast forward is kind of how these buttons work. So you can do very basic quick adjustments without going to the develop module. I find most people would rather use the sliders or the histogram to do that correcting anyway. However, if you're in a pinch and you just need to do something super quick, adjust, flip, and do things as you're organizing your image, that quick develop is there for exactly that. Obviously, it just has its limitations. So it is there, but I am going to go into the develop module. So to fix this backlit image, we're going to attempt to keep the sky exposed properly while adjusting everything in the foreground. So we're going to play with a few things and see how that looks. One of the first things we talk about is usually the exposure slider. It has a little bit of give without overexposing the sky too much. So I'm going to take that exposure slider and I'm going to go up a little bit, a good half a stop. He actually goes up to like 0.65. I think you can easily get away with that. You may decide to go a little bit lower than that. Now here's the thing that happens when we do that. When we do that and we overexpose the image as a whole, our sky was exposed properly, so now it's a little overexposed. It actually doesn't appear that way, but we have lost some of the detail in the highlights more so than anything else. The sky itself, the blue, the intensity of it is still pretty good, but when we do the exposure, the part that was properly exposed now is just a little bit more than we probably want. So one thing to do to compensate for that when you're doing the overall exposure is to bring down either the highlights or the whites. It does depend on the image. But in this image, the highlights is definitely the one to play with first, because that's that area here, not way on the far right where the clipping usually occurs. That's where the whites is. But in this highlight area, that's where a lot of that data falls. So I just want to pull that back a little bit, and I can do that either in the histogram or with the highlight slider. But since I know it's this data here, I would just rather grab it and pull it back. And see, he takes it to a -50, which I think is almost too much. Let's check that. Not too bad. My screen blinks when I flip back and forth, and it bothers me because I like the smooth transition. So what it's doing is it's essentially maintaining the sky. It lost a little bit in the clouds in the shadow area, not a whole lot, not enough to really do anything, I mean, to be a drastic change in this image. So between the exposure slider and bringing back some of the highlights, we're essentially maintaining the sky, but overexposing or trying to expose more of the buildings themselves. So when you do flip back and forth, even though it's a global adjustment, it really does appear that the majority of this adjustment so far is in the building. And do you remember the quick key to flip between the original and the adjusted image? Backslash. Yes, backslash. That little backslash key below your delete. It is one you will love to have. So next we want to open up that foreground just a little bit more. It is still a little dark. The exposure helped, but we need to play just a little bit more. And usually the shadow slider helps with that because the shadows are kind of the opposite. It's the opposite of the highlights. It's not quite the black clipping. It's that second little area within your histogram here before the midtones. So we want to crank that up, and he cranks it to an 80. Which sounds a little extreme. And at first, when you first do the shadow slider, it's like, oh, good. But then you would seem like you've lost a little bit of contrast. And that is what happens. You're losing some of that contrast. So we are going to put some of that back in eventually. But the other thing we have to pay attention to, and I'm going to zoom in here, as you expose some of this darker area, you can see, I don't know how well you can see it on the screen, but if you're using the same image, you'll see it. You're bringing out some of the noise that was in the darker area. So we are going to have to pay attention to that when we drag our shadow slider, how much noise is coming through. We might have to do a noise reduction. We might have to back off on the shadow slider. You can kind of play just a little bit. So we want to fix the fact that we're kind of losing some of that contrast. It's a little washed out. It's kind of muddy looking. So we're going to fix that, but we do have to watch for that noise too. So we might have to go to the detail area here, and I'm just going to pick a point over here so I can see that noise. So I'm going to the detail tab. I just grabbed that little square right there. I picked a spot in my photo where the noise is, or where I'm seeing it mostly, so that it shows magnified in here. And then I just want to drag the luminance slider up a bit to try and get rid of that. Ooh, that's a little bit too high. It does take a second to render, so you do have to give it time so that you don't have to redo something and it kind of goes out of control. We'll come back to noise reduction a little bit, but you can, at that point, that's probably where I would do the noise reduction, is after I crank up the shadows a little bit. I would go into that, try and remove some of that noise, so when I move forward with some of the other adjustments that I'm cleaning up with, I have a lot of that gone already. Not that it matters if you do it last or not. I just find it a little bit easier to see that final adjustment if I do it after I do those basic tonal adjustments. So now the washed out look we want to correct. Like there's some of the shadow area is kind of, it's muddy like I said, so it's a little gray, like that window should be a bit darker. We just want that to have contrast overall. So one way to do that, you could use the contrast slider. However, I don't think you have enough control with the contrast slider as you do if you were to play with the white and black sliders. Because essentially the contrast slider is like an auto contrast for the highlight, shadow, whites, and blacks. I would much rather ignore the contrast where possible and use these sliders because you get a more accurate adjustment. You don't have a choice between what where it's adding contrast in the highlights in the shadows when you use the contrast slider. This would give us that. So I need to add some darkness in. Some of the lighter values isn't too bad, but I think that just the black slider might work. So if you actually take it and you drag it to the left, you're gonna see those darker areas darken up. Now, he says that he takes it down to a -34. I don't necessarily agree that you have to go down that far. You do get some clipping in these areas here. If I turn this off, you can see. It's not the end of the world to have clipping down here, because this is an area that probably would fall completely black anyway. So it's not bad if it falls completely dark. Typically we try and get our images out of clipping in the black and clipping in the white, but you have to consider the content of the image. If it's okay for it to fall black and have no detail, then I wouldn't worry about it. But you do just have to be aware of what detail is there and what you would want to see. So I think 34 is a little bit too much. I would probably come back like 20 maybe would probably be enough, or just above that, maybe 25. I think that would be plenty and acceptable. And then you can see that when you look at the original, you've brought back that foreground. The background, the sky, is still exposed properly. It looks great. There's just a little bit lighter in the shadows up here, like in the clouds. That's where you see it the most. But other than that, we've brought back some of that contrast into the building. Even over here, that looks a lot better than it did before. It was just kind of light and it was falling apart a little bit. And then some of the noise. Now when the blacks got brought back, I noticed a little bit of the noise peeking out there, so I might go back into the details and just play with the noise reduction a little bit. Again, we're gonna come back to noise reduction, but I usually go back and I tweak it a little bit afterwards too. So this is a great technique to see to expose something that's backlit and expose that foreground properly. I think it works well. And it's not that many sliders. And if you want to see the side by side, you can hit the Y key to see the difference between the two. There we go. So that's the first problem to fix. The next problem is reducing noise. That's the next thing he talks about. So there are a couple techniques to talk about there. It's nothing, you guys have done a lot of noise reduction. If you're in digital editing or even digital editing advanced, these are things we're talking about. Actually, we will be talking about coming up. So it's very similar in Lightroom versus Photoshop. So if you're comfortable with using noise reduction, there isn't a whole lot more to talk about with that. I will just bring up the noise reduction image to show you some things in here. It's really hard to see that up there. Maybe if I do a 2:1, yeah, you can see that better. So when you have an image with a lot of noise, we typically go straight to the detail slider to play around. You need to at least zoom in when you're reducing noise. You can't look at the image as a whole to do that. You really do need to zoom in to that 1:1 ratio. At least. You can go in closer to 2:1. I don't think it's necessary to go in beyond 1:1, which is the default when you click on an image to zoom in. It just automatically goes to 1:1. So you're seeing essentially 100%. If you're thinking in terms of Photoshop when you zoom in and out. You're looking at your image at 100%. When I go 2:1, I'm going into 200%. So you should be fine doing 1:1. I'm simply zooming into 200 because you don't see as much of the noise up on the TV screen. So I'm going in a little bit further. You don't have to necessarily do that. And think about it too. When you do something with an image, you don't, no one's looking at it closer than 100%, essentially. You know, you're not getting up there with a magnifying glass looking at the pixels for a pixel of noise. Nobody does that. But you can certainly, if you really feel like being picky with it, you can go in closer to do this stuff. So noise reduction He says he actually reduces the color noise first, which I find interesting because I do it the opposite. I think it might depend on the image, to be honest. If you look at this image, there is a lot of color noise in there. And I don't know if you recognize the difference between just regular noise and color noise, but when you look at an image, there's, and I don't know, how well can you see it up there? Like right here, you can see some green. And then you see like little purple specks or magenta specks all over. There's a couple green specks here. And that's color noise. It's noise. It's color that doesn't belong there. But somehow with either adjusting or whatever, it brought out these colored pixels that don't match the rest of the image. So what we want to do is we want to essentially wash out that color and blend it with the surrounding pixels so that the colors match. So this image has a ton of color noise. It's a lot of green and magenta. And it's not chromatic abrasion because it's not just on the edges. It's all over throughout the image. And that's really the difference between what would be a chromatic abrasion and what is actual noise in your image. So he does the color slider first. And you'll see in noise reduction, you have a luminance slider and you have a color slider. So the luminance, if you're not familiar with the difference, the luminance is basically the overall lightness and darkness values of your image. And so it's looking at the lightness and darkness pixels that contain noise, and it's going to essentially eliminate that and smooth that out. The color looks for color noise pixels. It does exactly what it says, and then tries to blend it with the surrounding pixels to make that uniform color and get rid of the colors that should not be there. So he's actually using the color slider first. Again, I usually do it the opposite. I try and fix the noise and then reduce color noise where necessary. But honestly, you can do it either way. So he's taking, he said take it back to 0. It is at 0. Honestly, there's no magical setting for the color slider. It is simply just slowly dragging it, starting at 0, slowly dragging it to the right until all that color is gone. You don't need to go beyond that. Anything else is too much. So you only need to go to the point, and it's interesting when you slowly do it to see that color drop out. So you only need to go to the point where that color is gone. And for me, it's somewhere in the 30s. So if you have a different image, it might be a different number. He said he takes it all the way to 49. Maybe I'm missing it in another part of an image, but I see the majority of it going away somewhere in the 30s. Let's see if I take it up a little bit more, if it makes a difference. It's not a huge difference. No, I'd say high 30s, low 40s. You'll be fine if you take that away. Let's see, color setting. So visible improvement between a color setting of 49 and 100. Okay, I thought I missed something in there. Now, the detail slider is interesting. So each one of these, once you drag it off of 0, the detail slider, and then in the color noise, the smoothness, and in the luminance, the contrast, those sliders become active. But they're not active if you're not trying to reduce noise, which makes sense. Why would you have 2 sliders that only work when you slide the top one? So the other 2 will become active then. So now the detail slider, this basically controls how the edges of the image are affected. So when you drag that, by default it sets itself to 50, but you can kind of go up and down. I think what you'll find is that you stay pretty close to 50 for the detail slider. You probably won't tweak it too much above or beyond or from one extreme to the next, because you can, let me see if I can get this extreme here. See, I don't have it high enough to really see the difference. Yeah, you're not going to see a whole lot of difference here. Not in this image. Some images, the detail slider makes a huge difference. This image, not so much. I also find the detail slider in the noise, in the color noise reduction, you don't really do anything with compared to the detail slider in the luminance noise reduction. That one tends to be a little bit more obvious of an effect than the color one. So detail you can probably leave at 50 for the most part. Might decide to tweak it a little bit. I really don't think you'll need to. But usually if you do have to tweak it, it is going in the direction to the right to increase the detail a little bit. It's just kind of recovering some of the detail that is lost when you do the noise reduction. But I notice some of the color noise coming back when I do that. I had to crank it up a little bit more. I noticed some of the magenta and green coming back in these little pillars of detail. So I had to crank it just a little bit higher. Then you can go back. This smoothness, honestly, I don't know that you're going to touch this a whole lot. So I would just leave that alone. So now that you've done the color noise reduction, and if I turn that on and off, I don't know how well you can see the detail up there, but it gets rid of a lot of that magenta and green. Then we can worry about the luminance noise reduction. So now we have to try and get rid of the overall noise in the lightness and darkness values. And again, you can take this little target and you can pick a point in your image that you want to use and be able to see. It will show you at 100%. So this is actually not as zoomed in as I am on my screen. Usually it matches because you're zoomed into a 1-to-1, but it just allows you to look at your image in a different area and have a target point to look at over here too. So the luminance, we're just going to drag up a little bit, and it is another thing where you want to do it slowly. It really is hard to see the noise over here. You just want to do it slowly until that noise starts to go away, because you don't want to overdo it. When you overdo it, you muddle your image and all the detail is lost. So cranking that luminance is definitely not what you want to do. But you want to get to the point where a lot of that noise is gone, and then we'll try and recover some of that detail. So once I'm trying to think if he actually gave us detail settings here. Nope. Once you get that luminance to a point where you're feeling pretty comfortable with the noise reduction, and you can again flip it on and off to see what you're doing. Now you want to make sure that you're recovering some of that detail. So the detail slider, you might actually crank that up and see how you can actually, compared to the color slider, you can actually see the difference. So you might crank that detail slider up, but from the default of 50. But now you do have to be aware that as you do that, you might be adding some noise back in. So it's a toggle. It's a toggle between it. You might toggle the luminance and the detail until you get it just right. Because there isn't just a set this, and you're good to go. You do have to kind of pay attention to the other sliders and if they're adding noise back in. Now the contrast slider, and he even says it in here, and I agree, that the contrast slider really only has purpose if you have a super, super noisy image. Because it will, when you reduce some of that noise, you are losing a little bit of the contrast. So what it will do is it will find some of the edges and try and clear up some of those blotchy areas. But really, you're not going to use this a whole lot unless you have an image that's really bad where you had to crank the luminance quite far, and then you have to try and add some of that contrast back in, which in this image, it doesn't work at all. You don't see it. Bring this back. I don't remember where I had it. Somewhere down here. Oop. There we go. So contrast slider might be pretty minimal with what you're doing. He says, let's see. Oh, he does, right at the bottom here. So end result for this particular image, he had the luminance around 33, so I'm not too far off here. And then he actually took the detail slider to about 61. I have mine at 64. It's looking pretty good. And just leaving the contrast slider at 0. So turning that on and off, we have taken a ton of noise out of this image. And I gotta be honest with you, I like the noise reduction in here better than in Photoshop. For whatever reason, I always get a better result in Lightroom than I do in Photoshop. So it's my recommendation, but take it how you want. I would rather use it here. And I honestly wish I knew why, because I've tried plugging in the exact same numbers into Photoshop and Lightroom. And for whatever reason, I feel that Lightroom looks a little bit better when I do it. It's strange. I'm not quite sure why. Okay. Another thing I don't think we talked about it. I'm going to collapse some of this stuff here. Okay. One thing I don't know if we talked about, and I'm just going to point it out because he points it out in this chapter. I told you how you have pretty much unlimited undos, and it's not like Photoshop where you have your history palette and it only goes back a good 30 steps before, unless you change the default, it only goes back 30 steps before you can't undo back to a certainly like 50 steps. It also, when you save something in Photoshop and you close it, your entire history palette is wiped clean. It's only what you had open at that time and what you did. When you close it and reopen it, you're like starting from scratch as far as the history palette's concerned. In Lightroom, that is not the case. I can go back to any adjustment I've done on any image at any point, and my history palette is intact. And this one's ridiculous for this image because I kept sliding the sliders. So I can go all the way back in time to when I first imported the image. At any given time, I can go into a different collection right now and find a different image from a bazillion years ago. I shouldn't say a bazillion years ago, but like this one's last year. Let's find one. I know there's one outside that I had to tweak, but it says it's not connected. Okay, I'm gonna need a connected image or this will not work. Give me exclamation marks. There we go. Whoa. There we go. So if I go into my history palette, I imported this in June of 16. And as I mouse over it, I can see my history states. Like the navigator gives me a preview of what my previous history states were. So if I'm like, oh, what did I do there? I can go back just a couple of steps, or I can go all the way back to the beginning if I want and do whatever it is I need to do. So yeah, so the last time this was edited was June 28th of 2016, and my history is still completely intact for this image. I really, really like the fact that I can mouse over my previous, my history so that I can see exactly what I want to go back to. Because, you know, you might make a ton of adjustments with the same slider before you're happy and you're like, oh, crud, which one was that? And rather than guessing, you can visually see what it's going to look like. So I really like that. But one thing you have to get used to, and I still am not used to this, is the history palette in Photoshop. The last state of history is always on the bottom, and then you work your way back up. It's the opposite in Lightroom. The one on the top is the most recent, and then it works its way back down. So you have to get used to that. I'm still not used to it. I don't know if I ever will be, because I'm so used to years and years of Photoshop working from the bottom up in my history palette, and this is the opposite. So just be aware of that, but it will keep all of your history. That's part of the non-destructive edit in Lightroom, just like working with a Camera Raw file in the Camera Raw plugin. So it keeps everything. And unlike the Camera Raw plugin, it doesn't have that history state, so I can't just go back step by step to what I want. I would have to basically wipe it clean and start over or guess and tweak. Hence the snapshots that we do all the time. But that's really the history palette right there. Now, remind me, because I've done this now in 3 classes over the last few weeks. Did we talk about cropping in Lightroom?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I thought we did. I'm like, oh no, all the classes are molding together. It doesn't help that half of you are in some of the other classes, so it's mass confusion. Okay, so we did talk about cropping, so I don't have to talk too much about that. The only thing I want to point out as far as cropping is concerned is this feature called lights out cropping. And I'm gonna flip back to one of these images. I don't know, pick one, anyone, I guess it doesn't really matter. Lights out cropping is kind of a cool thing. It's like if I crop right now, you know, your image just kind of darkens around the corner here. But if you want lights out cropping basically eliminates everything that's outside the crop box. Some people really like this. To get to the lights out cropping, you can edit full screen too. So this goes for editing, not just the lights out cropping. If you're editing something or you're looking at an image, you can go into essentially a full screen mode. But if you hit the tab key, it hides your left and right panels, giving you a little bit more real estate, especially if you're trying to compare multiple images. This gives you a little bit more space and makes them larger. So the tab key hides and expands those side panels. But if you hit the Shift Tab key, it hides all of your panels, which is kind of cool. And then you would just hit Shift Tab when you want to go back. So why I show you this is because when you hit Shift Tab to hide all your panels, you can go into lights out mode and have a kind of like a full black screen and just see that final image without any of the other distractions that are in Lightroom. So if you hit the L key, you go into lights out mode, but there's actually different levels to lights out mode, which is kind of cool. Like this one just darkens everything. If I were to hit L again, it goes completely black.
I like this.
Awesome.
I didn't even know about that.
It is really cool. And then you can just click and expand. I'm in the crop tool, so I can click and expand this and still move it around like I would, but I have zero distractions and I can see exactly what this is going to look like when it's done. So the lights out mode is simply L for lights out. It's easy to remember. You don't have any other command keys or things to hit, just the L key. So push it one time, you get that kind of like 80% darkened screen. Push it again, it goes completely black. Push it a third time and you go back to where you started. So you're just toggling through, you just hit L till you get to where you want it to be. So it is a very cool feature. I think it's underused. It's easy to forget that it's there too. But it also is really nice if you're presenting images to somebody. You can go to lights out mode and just flip through images and they see it essentially on the black screen. So I'm going to hit Shift Tab to get all my stuff back. But yeah, that's pretty much everything as far as cropping that I would like to go through again. I don't remember if I talked about adjusting the angle or not. I thought I did, but just in case. Not only do we have the cropping options, but we have the angle where we have the slider and we can turn it. The one thing Lightroom does that's different than some other programs is that it can't go beyond what exists for the image. So like in Photoshop, I might get like white areas that I have to crop off or expand pixels to fill in. In Lightroom, it doesn't let us do that. It will fit within the space that we have. We have no choice in this matter. So we'll always get a cropped in image when we use that. But you can draw the angles. So that little ruler level icon here, if you click it, you get the little level, and then you can just draw a straight line across whatever should be straight, and then it will automatically tweak that for you. So I think that was one part I did not cover. And then of course you always just hit return to accept your crop. Or there's the reset button at the bottom to go back to the beginning. And then the crop tool is the R key, which is weird. Okay, that's everything about crop. Yay! Straightening crooked photos. I did that. Okay, the clone stamp tool in here, or they call it the, what did they call it in here? I call it the clone stamp tool. I know that's not the correct word. I think it's the spot, there we go, spot removal tool. Use the right terms. The spot removal tool is one we haven't talked about yet. We've talked about the adjustment brush, the crop. We've talked about the radial, the gradated filter, and then the radial filter. I never talk about this one. This is in this chapter if you want it, but the third one from the left is the red eye removal. We should not have red eyes in any of our photos. We are not using a point and shoot camera with a flash. So we should never have to deal with that. So I don't even bother talking about it. But if you find you need it, it is in chapter 8. So you can certainly go to it. It's like a little bit further than where I am right now. It's on page 306 if you really need it. Otherwise, the spot removal tool is the only one we haven't really talked about. I know we touched on it just a tiny bit in conversation, but didn't really go through using it. I'm going to use the image he has because, I believe it's this one. There we go. Because this image, let me go back here. This image has a lot of dust on the sensor, and so it needs to be removed. So I'm going to zoom back out here. So I'm going to use the spot removal tool for this. Now, this one does take a little bit to get used to as far as the quick key because it is Q and it makes no sense whatsoever. But when you get used to it and once you memorize it, you're good to go. But unlike the clone stamp tool in Photoshop and stuff like that, where it might be a little bit easier to remember, the spot removal tool is Q. And I have no way of remembering it except for the little icon itself could lead to being a Q if you tipped it. I don't know, I got nothing. I could see it looking a little bit like a Q if we turned it a little bit and that arrow was pointing down, but then it would always also be very close to a gender symbol. I don't know, it's Q, either way. So this tool has the ability to heal and clone. And I'm hoping you know the difference between the two. Clone is an exact clone, and heal is a blending of what's surrounding it. So with either one of these, what they do, I'm going to use the heal first just to kind of show you. Just like the adjustment brush, you can increase and decrease with your bracket keys. So that's nothing different. That's kind of a nice thing. You do have the feather option here, and you'll see the second, make this larger so you can see the two of them. And you do see that second ring, and then you have that outer ring, which is where it feathers to. The inner ring is the actual brush size. Or wait, no, I'm saying that backwards. The inner ring is the feathering. The outer ring is the actual brush size. So you'll see that inner ring go in. So it will feather from all the way to the edge and then in. And then this is the size. Opacity, it does exactly what you think it does, but for the most part, I think a lot of us just use it at 100%. And then when you click with the heal brush, what it does is it brushes, but then you'll notice that it goes from a starting point to where it's healing from. And it just automatically picks a point, which for the most part is okay. I find that it doesn't always pick the spot that I want. You can simply grab and move this to a different spot if you find it's picking the wrong spot. So that is something that's nice. I gotta zoom out here. And that is something that's nice that I can simply go and I can grab a different spot if I don't like where it's grabbing from. I do think it works well. As far as the healing brush, not the clone. Yeah.
Is there a way to hide the little circles? Like so you don't have to leave?
Yes. What is the, I think it's just a quick key. There is.
Like in Photoshop, you can just uncheck it.
Yeah. You are right. There is a way to do that, and I think there's a key you have to remember for it. Brush size. Let me see if I can't find that. Choose clone. Oh, you know what? I think he has it in the tips at the end of the chapter. I remember seeing it in this book, but I always forget what it is. Oh my gosh, this chapter wants to go on forever. Okay, let's see if I can find it. Using the details. Copy, start over. Tool overlay. Let's try this one and see if it's in here. There we go. In the Tools menu, under Tool Overlay, you can choose. By default, it's set to Auto Show. But it's the H key, that's the key I was thinking of. It's the H key to hide or never show those. So if you check that box, it will turn them all off. But you can continue to use the tool as needed.
That's a lot nicer.
It is a bit easier, especially when you have a lot to clean up.
Yeah,
it is.
The lens that I shot with is just all spotty up in the sky.
Covered, oh, yeah. And it's the same spot on every image too, isn't it? So here's what's really cool about that. You can clean all those spots up, and then after you have them all cleaned up, and my monitor is dirty, I can't tell what's a monitor spot and what's on the image. I'll show you a trick to find that out too. But once you have it all done, you can use and I don't think he supplied us with another image, but I could highlight 2 images that have this dust in the same spot, and then I can use this sync key at the bottom. And what this sync key will do is it has, and I think we've talked about it briefly, where I can sync one setting to all of my images. The synchronized settings takes the data from the first one and the changes that I've made, the first selected image, and then it applies it to everything else that's selected. So I can choose what I use and what I don't, but I have the option to check spot removal right here. So if the dust is in the same spot on every picture, I can simply just sync spot removal, and then it will apply it to every image and take the dust out on all of them.
Well, that'll save me some time.
It's gonna save you a lot of time. You may have to tweak a few spots because if it's removing dust like on an edge, it might blur it a little funny. So you might have to tweak those. But other than that, the majority of it will be fixed on all your images. It's gonna save you a ton of time. Just remember to uncheck it when you don't want it or you will not be happy. So there is another way to find that dust because in certain images it's not obvious, in other images it is. So if you truly want to find all the dust spots in an image, and especially if your monitor is dirty and you can't tell what's dust on the monitor and what's on the image, you can actually use and I have to remember if it is just in fact the option. No, it is not. I always forget this key, because I don't use it as often as I should. I will fully admit this. Turn the checkbox. Where's this magical checkbox? Oh, visualize spots. There it is. Seriously, I always forget this, and it's so obvious. Right down here, it has a spot for visualize spots, and it does kind of like when we hold on the option key and we drag sliders for certain things, like for masking and stuff. You will see all of your spots. And you can also move this slider around to find them. So now I can see spots that I couldn't really see in there, and I can actually do all of my spot removal here. So I can simply click and do all my spot removal if I want to right here. And it actually goes a bit faster, which is why I curse myself for forgetting this all the time. Move that over. There we go. So it works really well. So it is the visualize spots at the bottom, and then the slider to show and hide those spots. If you really need to see all the spots, you can crank it and try and get rid of them. But some of them, you have to be aware, it could be like a bird in this photo. So I do have to be kind of careful how high I drag that and what I'm getting rid of. But in those areas where it's hard to actually see some of those spots, this is awesome. And then I just uncheck that. When I want to go back to my image, I can do exactly what Ashton just asked and turn off, do that never show or the H key. And the H will toggle it on and off. So I can see where it's cloning that stuff and how clean it is. And I can turn this on and off to show and hide my spots overall. I swear he gave us a second image. Is it the next one? It is. No, he doesn't. He doesn't give us more than one image, but in the book he talks about how he has similar images. He just has different compositions of the same thing, and all the dust is in the same spots, and how he synced it together. So that's in there if you ever need to go back to it. But that is one way to use the spot removal tool. Now, there is, you do have the option of using the clone. And the clone stamp, I'm trying to think, is he using it right here? Or is he... where I find the healing brush, regardless of what he's talking about in here, I'm going to flip to this next image here. Where I find the healing brush doesn't work well is when you have high contrast edges, like the sky to this very light colored building. It does not work very well when I use that brush. I gotta stop using this 2-to-1. If I use the healing brush and I'm trying to let me reduce the feathering just a little bit. Let's say I'm just trying to take out a spot here. What I find is that when it heals, you can see it pulled some of the sky into it. So that's where the healing brush doesn't work well. But this is no different than the healing brush in Photoshop, to be honest. So that's where I would use the clone. So I would switch over to the clone here. And then the clone does exactly that. It duplicates something onto the area that you're brushing. Now here's where it differs from Photoshop, is that I gotta zoom out here. There we go. Where it differs from Photoshop is in Photoshop, you have to pick a target point first and then brush over the part that you want to get rid of. It's the opposite in Lightroom. In Lightroom, you brush the spot, and this wasn't a very good spot to start. I should probably use a smaller brush. I'm just simply brushing in a straight line here, and I'm going to brush the spot that I want to remove. I'm going to go right into the sky here. And then it picks a spot it thinks will clone well. Oops, I need to see it. Turn my H back on. So it picks a spot that it thinks will work well, and it just does it. Now here's the problem. I need to zoom in here. It didn't line it up, so it wasn't perfect. It's not bad, but I can move this around because I find in the clone stamp, while the healing brush, I think Lightroom picks pretty good spots for the most part as far as how it heals and blends everything together. I find exactly this problem when I use the clone stamp. It doesn't always do what I want it to do. However, I can grab and move this spot. Okay, I gotta zoom out in order to do this though. I can grab and move the spot that it chose, and I can pick something different if I want to. So I might pick something pretty close. I think it actually picked a good spot, it just didn't line up perfectly. So I might just have to, come on, my mouse is picky today. I might just have to tweak it to a point where my roof lines up again to get rid of that spot. There we go. If I look at it, that's actually not too bad. Let me go back in here and turn it on and off. So the only problem I have with this image is when I cloned it, it gave me a pretty hard edge right here for that clone. What I find works well in this case, because it isn't perfect, even though the cloning did a pretty good job here, it's still not perfect, but it's pretty close. Even though the cloning is really good, that hard edge, I find what I end up doing is I go back to the heal tool, and now the trick is that when you use the heal tool, I want to heal that edge right there. I have to be careful where I brush with it because it gets to the point where it recognizes my other cloning point and it won't let me brush that close. So I find I have to kind of start just to the side of where it recognizes that spot. Draw another one. And I don't like where it pulled that one. There we go. So I use the clone stamp tool and the healing brush. And it, of course, if I turn those spots off, if I hit the H key and turn it off, it lets me do whatever I want to do. It's when I have it turned on where it's a big issue, where it won't let me get that close to it. But I healed what the clone stamp couldn't fix, and it actually looks pretty good. I could, and I probably would, actually go back to where this roof, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to. No, go back. To where this roof doesn't line up completely. I might clone that spot also. I might use the clone stamp tool with a smaller brush. Go back to my clone stamp here. With a smaller brush and just brush over that spot that's not perfectly even. Where is it pulling it from? I need my H. And then just try and fix it. See, the roof isn't completely lined up, so I don't know that I'm going to find the perfect spot that lines up completely. Darn stucco building. It's enough that it'll be okay. There, that's not too bad. From back here, you're not really going to notice. So now I've completely cleaned that up. Now the other thing he does is talk about removing something larger, which is kind of interesting. He actually didn't want this second window in there. He wanted to take it out completely. So he's using the clone stamp tool. The heal brush will not work for this. I've tried it just out of curiosity. It's a hot mess. So the clone stamp tool is definitely the one to use. You can get a much bigger brush in this case and just kind of brush around the window. And it chose the window. Wasn't that interesting? No, don't choose the window. Get a spot that doesn't have a window. Okay, now the tricky part is it is kind of a big area. Where did he end up pulling it from? Oh, he went right next to it. brushed too big of a spot. I don't have enough space. I probably should have brushed a smaller spot. Here, let me do that one over. Nice thing is you can use the active one and just hit the delete key to get rid of it. Let's just do this smaller, a little bit closer, since we are cloning overall. One thing you do have to watch for is when you are getting very precise as to what you're cloning, what your feathering is. Because if it's too big, hey, that's not bad. I could probably use that. You just have to watch the shading, obviously, when you're cloning something. See, that's too light of a spot. Man, Lightroom did a better job than that. Somewhere around here. Not too bad. You can adjust the feathering afterwards, which is kind of a cool thing. As long as it's the active pin. I'm trying to feather as much as possible. See, I think I still need to heal those edges. I don't like how that looks. So I'm going to go back to the healing brush, and I'm just going to, yikes! Where is it pulling that from? Why? Why? Just pull from above it. Sometimes I wish I could pick the points that it is healing from. This isn't the worst, but I want it a little bit cleaner. There we go. There, that's a little bit better. Not too bad. So now we've completely removed the window, before, after, and the wire. So we've cleaned up this image quite a bit. Now this one is a bit easier than other images you might have because it's a white building with a solid blue sky and we have enough space to clone out these windows. So this is like a really good case scenario, but you can at least see how it works and play around with it a little bit. Okay, so that's pretty much the clone stamp as a whole. Q key is the quick key. Otherwise it's the second one in. Tool in, and then don't forget those switches are at the bottom. And then if you want to hide and show those, it's the H key or it's in the tools menu under tool overlay. Okay. So I'm going to get out of that for a second there. So another thing he talks about, how's my time going here? Okay. Another thing he talks about is he's talking about fixing lens distortion. I know we talked about it briefly, and a lot of you have talked about it in digital editing, so I'm not going to go through it too much. I just want to make sure you know where it is and just how it's similar as far as Camera Raw or just the filter in Photoshop. But lens correction has its own tab entirely. There is a profile tab and a manual tab. And again, this is very much like Photoshop. So the profile tab is pretty much the automatic one where you can enable a profile correction. I should probably pick the right image for this. There we go. We're just trying to fix the lens distortion on this particular image. So what it does, what lens correction does, it goes and it looks at the metadata of the image and it pulls the actual camera lens that was used and applies a profile for that lens on auto-fixing the distortion in it. So we can see a couple of things. It is a little bit of a wide angle lens. I don't know if he says which lens is used in here, but it will tell us in a second. And then there's also a little bit of vignetting on all the edges because of the fact that it's a wide angle. That could be a lens hood, but it could be the distortion of the wide angle itself, or the vignetting of the lens itself from being a wide angle lens. So we're gonna try and correct some of that stuff. So we can automatically do it by enabling a profile correction, and you can see it automatically found the lens that goes with it. I don't think we have to change it for this one. I gotta see if he tells us which lens it is. No, but you would know obviously with your own image if that's the lens that was used. You can look at the metadata for the image. I can go back to grid view if I want to, and I can go and I can dig up the metadata for it. So it does tell me the lens, it was a 28-300 Nikon lens. So when I'm in develop, I just have to make sure the make is a Nikon, the model is 28-300. So it picked that exact lens. And then it will just simply apply the profile. So you can see if I turn this on and off, the drastic difference between the two. Even if I put them next to each other, you can see the difference. It took care of the vignetting too. And you can correct it afterwards. There is some ability here as far as distortion slider, vignetting slider. But now the manual tab is very similar. Let me get rid of this. This is where we can do the defringing or our chromatic abrasion if we want to. We can also take care of vignetting with a little bit more control than in the profile because we have a midpoint slider in addition to the amount slider. And then we do have some more distortion options up here. So, and when you mouse over it, you see the grid come up to make it a little bit easier to align whatever it is you want to align. But I think it's worth trying the profile one first because it may be a quicker adjustment for you and require less of your time. But know that the manual one allows you just a little bit more control if it's not perfect or you can't find like your lens in the list. Not that that should ever happen, but you never know. So that would be the basics of that lens correction. But I know a lot of you have experience with that, so I'm not gonna go too much further with that one. Let's see here. Distortion, distortion, distortion. He has quite a few distortion images in here to play with. It's like these next four are all distortion images. Like that one's ridiculous. Did he give?
It's probably like a 6mm.
I wonder what that is. It is, well, it says it's an 8-15 at 15mm. Is that one?
Looks like
Yeah, it actually looks like it's wider than that.
insane.
Oh, it does say fisheye. It's a fisheye lens
Okay.
at 15mm. That makes sense.
'Cause I use a 15 a lot and I don't have that much distortion.
Yeah. Yep, this one's the fisheye, so that would make sense.
6.5mm though. That's a different story.
Yeah, that's definitely a different story. Click on the basic tab, go to the auto button. Nope. I want. Where's he? Okay. Let's go to. I want to try something real quick. I want to see if it does what I want it to do. This one's not going to find the lens, is it? Alright. So it was a Canon 8. Of course it's not on this list. Why is it not on this list? Lens profile. Click on the basic tab, click on the auto button. That's not what I want it to do. Why am I not getting... Why am I not getting that menu with this image? Sorry, talking out loud to myself. I'm trying to figure out why I'm missing some of the buttons I want. I must be missing something in here. Yes, why am I missing it? I have been missing it from the beginning. We are missing a couple of tabs here in lens correction. Wow, that's strange. Did they move it under camera calibration? No. I wonder if this edition moves things. Well, there's upright. It's not what I was looking for, but that's one other thing I wanted. This book does have, now that I'm looking at it, they moved a couple of things. In the book, when he is talking about, let's see, grid, where does he start talking about it? He's talking about upright at the end of working with this image right here. So on like page 310, 311, he starts talking about the upright fixes. And in this book, he tells you it's in lens correction under the basic tab, but that's not there. It is actually under the transform tab, which is new to this version. There's something else I'm looking for that I can't find, but I'll have to look for it later. It's not a big deal. So if you're referencing the book, just know that come about page 310, 311, he starts talking about upright. It is no longer in lens correction. It is in transform, which is new to this version, and upright is in there. This is very much like what we were doing in Camera Raw, which I know a lot of you have done, where we can draw the 4 corner points, like where those lines are, and it essentially will distort the image to, remove any like perspective and stuff like that, as if we were able to shoot straight onto something. So like for this part, I could use this image, honestly. So for this particular image, I could use any of these sliders. Vertical does kind of like its vertical distortion here. We got the horizontal doing exactly that. Rotate, the aspect, overall, the scale of the whole image, and then we offset left and right and up and down. I need to reset this. Reset. Why are you not resetting? Really? Why are you not resetting? Okay, reset it all back to 0 here. So what I can do, I find this easier than using these sliders. We have this little, almost like looks like a crop icon, but it's the upright tool. And what it allows us to do is draw 4 lines of where those edges should be completely straight, and it just kind of tweaks and adjusts the image and distorts it back to being more like a straight on. So I need at least 3 lines for this to truly work accurately. And as I click, and I can basically just click, but click and drag to find my lines here. I'm gonna draw line there, line there. So once I get 2, it starts adjusting it. But where it becomes most effective is once I start drawing the rest of these lines. Best case scenario is if you can draw 4 lines. I probably should have drawn a bit closer, but we'll just try and make it parallel. So you can see when I draw this line, it really distorts the image. However, the building appears to be straight on. The challenge I have is that this is not because of the lens, but I can correct this quite a bit. Maybe I could draw, can't remember what my total lines that I can draw in here. Yep, I was gonna say, I thought it was 4. Let's try deleting that one and doing this and see what happens. Hey, that's pretty good actually. That's not too bad. This is still a bit distorted, but I can get away with it. Wow, it's got a lot of chromatic abrasion on it. So that guided tool allows me to straighten this. This building is pretty much straight. It actually isn't too bad, but it just kind of distorts everything. And then all I would do is either drag the scale slider, or I have an option for constrain crop, which will just crop it in to where there are no pixels, or I mean to the edge of where the pixels end, so that I don't have that white space in there when I undo that, which of course won't show it to me now. If I go into the crop tool, it does. So it saves me a step from going into the crop tool, essentially is what it's doing. I would just go back into the crop tool if I needed to tweak it. Like maybe I'd want to bring it in a little bit more so that I could crop down and get some more of that. But that's essentially what it would do. So it's a drastic difference, but it works. So that's the upright tool. Fixed vignetting, I don't need to talk about that. We've done that. Sharpening would be the other one. I know you guys have done some sharpening before, but I just want to point out a page rather than go through it. On page 319, he talks about, in 3 different spots, he talks about what all the sliders mean. Let me go back here and go to this particular image. He talks about what each of the sliders mean on this. Let me go back to detail and sharpening. So he explains the amount slider does exactly what you think it would do, controls the amount of sharpening applied to the photo. A little bit further down in step 3, he says the radius slider determines how many pixels out from the edge of the sharpening it will affect. So usually you leave that pretty low because you get this halo effect otherwise if you go too much higher with that slider. Like if I drag this one up and I drag the radius up at some point here. He didn't give us a high-res image to really look at because I can't get in any further. Trying to find an edge that would be the most obvious, but at some point that radius gives you kind of like a blurred halo effect. You can kind of see it on this one. This image isn't a good example for that slider, but typically you keep it pretty low. But he just explains the radius, and then in step 4 he's got a section about a third of the way down where he talks about the detail slider, and it tries to kind of counteract that radius so that you don't get that halo effect. It's trying to eliminate that halo effect caused by the radius slider. So they're kind of just compensating for each other. So he explains all 3 of those. And then most of you know this already, but the masking filter, if I hold down my option key, shows me what it's masking it out of. So if I'm sharpening, but I don't want to sharpen the sky, I can eliminate that detail from here so that I don't add noise or anything unnecessary. I can use that masking slider. But if I want to see the mask, hold down the option key, just like we've talked about for many sliders. So I'd go probably just to the point where it's out of the sky. I don't even know what settings he has here. 25, leave that pretty close to 1. What did he take this one up? 90. There we go. Just use his settings. So for this particular image, if you just wanted to see the difference, he used a sharpening amount of 90. Mine's at 89 here. 90. He kept the radius slider. He bumped it up to 2. I always found that that was too much for this image. So like 1.5 I think is probably a little bit more acceptable. And then the detail slider, it always starts at 25. For this one, he actually cranked it to 75. Which seems pretty high. Let me go back into 2-to-1 here. See if we can see the difference here. So it's reducing some of that halo effect, keeping as much of that detail as possible. Detail at 25. Radius 1.5. Oops. I dragged the wrong one. There we go. So trying to eliminate some of that halo to keep as much detail in there with 75. I don't think, maybe I will bump it up to 2. So you can see the difference in the image. I'm at 200%, but if I zoom out, you can see the difference in that image. It actually helps quite a bit for this image. When you get in pretty close, it's a little sloppy. I'd probably adjust it a little bit more, but the detail in the building and the texture is brought out a lot more. So he just explains those sliders a little bit more in depth if you would like to. And then on the next page, he uses a portrait and he talks about sharpening a little bit more, but then masking it out of the skin, which is something that we've talked about. So I'm not going to go really into the settings and stuff like that. I'm simply going to go to the masking tool, hold down the option key, and all you do is you just drag it till it's not affecting the skin but still allowing you to add sharpening into the hair and the eyes and the edges of the face where you typically would want that detail to fall. So you can see when you turn it on and off that you get a lot of detail back in the eyes and in the hair. But it's not affecting the skin, which is nice. Go a little further if I wanted to. I always find I have to be careful with the masking. I don't want the skin completely dark because what I find if I do that is that, and in this image it's not as obvious, but like you get this obvious sharpening edge and you can almost see the fall off, almost like it doesn't feather it enough. So I try and have just a tiny bit in the skin, not a whole lot, but enough so it's not too drastic of a difference. This image is a good example, so it's harder to see that in it, but certain images you notice it a bit more. So that's what he talks about right there. But pretty much, for the most part, that's really everything that I want to talk about at this point. as far as chapter 8 is concerned, if you wanted to look through the basic camera calibration in Lightroom, it's the last thing that he does in that chapter. And also right before that, he talks about fixing the chromatic aberration. But I know you guys have all gone through that in Photoshop. It's the same thing. It's just in the lens correction tab here. And it's in the manual if you want control over it. That's where it falls. So it's all in lens correction, but that's no different than camera raw. So that's all the same. But other than that, he has some good tips and tricks at the end of this chapter. His Lightroom killer tips, I think, are really good in this chapter, especially since we're talking about editing. So it is worth your time to go through those 2 pages at the very end of the chapter, because he talks a little bit about cropping, customizing a crop overlay, stuff like that. So if you want specific crop sizes that aren't there, he talks about doing that. Deleting multiple spot repairs at the same time, you might like that too. So that's pretty much everything within this chapter. All techniques that you pretty much know, it's just where they are and maybe different things to think about when you're using it is pretty much the goal of this chapter. So use this chapter as a reference for everything through the rest of the semester. People reference this chapter probably the most, and chapter 6 that we went through last week. Those are probably the biggest 2 references in the entire book. You'll find yourself going back to it when you're looking for settings and number values just as a starting point. But also when you're working on your project, I want you to keep those 2 chapters in mind, because that's really what you're trying to do, is bring forth the best possible edited image for what you're going to do for next week. And the goal next week really is to just simply go through your projects, present your projects right away. I wanted to bring this up earlier. Let me bring this up right now here. So you can kind of see where we're heading now that we're through a lot of the editing stuff. I mean, not completely through the editing, but pretty much through a lot of the editing parts. You'll see that I actually have set next week after your presentation, we're going to talk about presets a little bit. So if you have something, bring it with you. Things like I want to create vintage images, or I do this sharpening all the time. Like, just kind of bring those settings with you so that you can essentially just plug in the values, and I'm going to show you how to save those as presets. So I'll have a few presets for you to create next week, but otherwise I kind of just want you to play around with the edits that you do a lot in Lightroom, and then we're going to save some of those as presets. So it's just helpful if you have some of that just written down, because you know it's an edit you do often. If not, I mean, don't worry about it, but that's kind of the plan. So with that, next week your project is due. You are simply going to be explaining your project, bringing it up in Lightroom, showing us the images, kind of your thought process behind how you edited, if there was a specific way, like if you chose black and white for everything, and maybe things that you found as you were doing that. Other than that, just kind of have everything ready for next week. You're going to turn in the Lightroom catalog for your project, for your whole group. You're going to turn in the catalog with all the images so that I can go through and see the edits and how you organized. Don't forget that you need to do virtual copies of all of your edits. It's in this one. This one. That you need to complete virtual copies of it, or multiple ones of the same images, however many virtual copies is required for you. So you can organize this in any way, shape, or form. I really want you to practice the workflow process from taking the image all the way to presenting the image and organizing everything in between on top of editing in Lightroom. So, but you do need to make a virtual copy of it for it. So just don't forget, because that's the thing that everyone forgets. Just to point that out again. Yes?
What's that again?
The virtual copy is simply, whoops, I'm not in grid view, making a copy of the image so that you have multiple examples of the same image. So if I were to create a virtual copy of this image, I now have a little page curl here. So I have a copy of the original. Let me make one more of these. I can make this image in develop module a black and white if I wanted to. Why is this not working? Hello. Well, isn't that interesting? Why is that not working? All right, let's tweak that one, and then I'm going to go to the second copy, and maybe this one I'm going to split tone. Yikes. We're going quite drastic here. So now what I have is I have 3 copies of the same image and just variations of the same thing. And it's taking up 0 space on my computer. It's like in Adobe Camera Raw when we do snapshots of different variations of it. This is kind of like using snapshots.
And you have to have one of each photo?
Yeah, yep. So all the 50 that you choose, when you go to edit those, make a virtual copy and edit the virtual copy.
So it'll be like 100 thumbnails.
You'll essentially have 100, yeah. I mean, you might have more, you end up rejecting them, stuff like that, but yeah. Of the 50 you choose, you'll have double. Anyone have a question on the project? Oh yeah, Travis.
So, is there a whole group doing 50, or are we doing 50 each?
50 total.
Oh, total?
Yep. So you can kind of divide it up how you want. So you might do like 20, 25 each, and then whittle it down to the 50 you choose. But yeah, in the end, it's just 50 total to show. Makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so the time that we have left, I would like to give you that to get together with your groups, see where everyone's sitting, plan for getting it all completed. Think about obviously using those Flex Lab times. You're going to want those Flex Lab times to finish that project. Find the times that work best for everyone or how you're going to communicate that stuff. And then when you come in next week, your catalog should be ready to go. So you should have the catalog all set, combined, however you decide to go about combining those. Have it all combined in together so that you can submit one catalog for your entire group, and then that's what you'll present. Make sense? All right, so go ahead and use the time for whatever you need it to be, and obviously Flex Lab. I just found out last night, next Thursday, which won't affect your project, but next Thursday I am not available for Flex Lab, and then if I have you for class on Monday, for either digital editing or digital editing advanced, I'm not going to be here on Monday either. So I will be pre-recording those 2 classes and then post those so that you can get all the information that you need. But as far as Flex Lab is concerned, just know that the Monday, Thursday, I can certainly do virtually, but I won't physically be here.
So there's like no class Monday?
No class on
So
Monday.
just
Yeah.
look on Blackboard for the class, basically.
Yep, exactly. So I'll have it all set. I'm going to record everything tomorrow that you guys need, put it up there. I'm going to send out a message too, so you'll get that information. But some of you are in class on Monday, so I'll give you the heads up.
Hopefully I remember. Otherwise I'll be kind of mad. Get
Maybe
me
I'll
out.
I'll preset an announcement in there as a reminder that opens up on Monday. Don't come, ... Ashton. All right.